This is a demo of the Informix Flexible Grid Technology and Open Admin tool. This is part 1 in a 2-part series of grid demos, and this first part will cover the setup and administration of grids in OAT. Before we jump into grids in OAT, let's take a moment to talk about what is an Informix Flexible Grid. Simply put, a grid is a set of replication servers that simplifies administration and provides linear scalability. Tasks or statements run on one server in the grid are automatically run on all other servers in the grid, including schema updates, stored procedures, and administration commands. On the administration side, a grid can be very useful if you have multiple replication servers and you need to perform the same tasks on every server. For example, you can update the database schema by adding or altering tables. You can run administration commands, such as adding a chunk, run stored procedures, or update data. With Informix Flexible Grids, an open admin tool, you can easily manage multiple replication servers from a single location. To get to grids in OAT, you expand the replication section of the OAT menu and then click on Grid. So the first part of our demo will show the initial setup of a grid in OAT. To create a grid in OAT, you go to the Actions menu at the top of the page and select Create Grid. The first part of defining a grid is to give it a name. We'll call ours My Grid. Then we need to choose the servers that will make up the grid. Here I have 6 geographically distributed servers, and I want to add all of them to my grid. Then I need to define which servers will be the source servers of the grid. A source server is the server within the grid on which I will run the commands that should be propagated to all other servers. Lastly, I need to define the authorized users for the grid, or those users who will run the commands from the source servers that should be propagated throughout the grid. On this page, I can review the statements that OAT will use to create the grid. OAT uses SQL to create the grid, but I can also review the equivalent CDR versions of these commands. When I click Finish, OAT will create the grid. When I close the wizard, I can now see that my grid is shown in the tree on the left. If I click on my grid, I can see details about this grid. The Grid Members tab shows me a list of all servers in the grid. It also gives me an indication of which ones are the source servers and which are the member servers. I can also switch to the node view, which will show me a graphical depiction of my grid. In the second part of this demo, we'll talk about the connection manager for grid and how you would define service level agreements to help with workload balancing across the grid. You configure workload balancing when you create or modify a service level agreement or SLA. I have already set up on the command line a connection manager for the servers that I've defined in the grid. I can manage this connection manager called Grid CM1 in OAT. As you can see, this connection manager already has one SLA defined. But suppose I want to define a new service level agreement for my grid. I have reports that I only want to run on my US-based servers. To do this, I can go to the Action menu and click Create SLA. First, I'll give my SLA a name, and then I'll add to this SLA the two US-based servers, Chicago and Denver. And then I have the option of defining policies that the connection manager will use to redirect clients to either Chicago or Denver. Suppose I want workload to be the biggest factor in determining which server to redirect the client to. To do this, I can adjust the weights of the three factors: latency, failure, and workload. I want to give workload a weight of about 80 and 10 each for latency and failure. After defining the policies and the servers for this SLA, I can click Next to review the SQL that OAT has generated. Clicking Finish will create my new service level agreement. I can see my new Report USA service level agreement by expanding Grid CM1. Now suppose over time my business is expanding and I add a new server in Hong Kong. I'll want to add this to my grid, which I can do very easily through OAT. I have many options for modifying a grid in OAT. I can add new members, I can change the authorized users, I can enable or disable source servers, or I can even remove a server entirely. But here, I just want to add a new member. My Hong Kong server is already up and in the SQL host file of my other servers, so I can use the OAT wizard to add it to my grid. If I wanted to add Hong Kong as a source server, I can do that here as well. As before, I have the opportunity to review the SQL before applying these changes. Scaling my grid over time is as easy as this. But I probably also want to add Hong Kong to my service level agreements. So let's complete this story. I can find Modify SLA in the Action menu. All I need to do here is add Hong Kong to the servers in the SLA. I can review the SQL and then click Finish to commit the operation. This completes the grid setup and administration demo in OAT. We've seen how to create a grid, add a service level agreement, and add a new member server to the grid. But there's much more to grid than this, so please see part 2 of this demo to learn about how to monitor grid commands and correct failures.